Tonight, we won't open dusty chronicles to measure Viking kings or recite the sagas line by line. Instead, I'll step into a land where survival itself was the only true saga, where the frost could write on your bones as easily as on the grass, and where every morning was an agreement, struck between human stubbornness and the North's endless cold. Here, wool wasn't just clothing, it was armor. Stones weren't just stones, but guide sunstones that caught hidden rays when even the sky had doubts. Life was stitched together from fur, fire, and faith, each day a small treaty signed with winter. Some say the Vikings endured not because they were fearless, but because they understood that hardship could be rehearsed, the way you rehearse a story until it becomes memory. So lower the lights. Let the hush of the northern winds press against your chest. And if your breathing begins to match the slow rhythm of oars dipping into dark water, that's just the fjord carrying you with it. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next fire burning in the north will be waiting for you there. And when the glow fades, imagine yourself settling into their silence. The wind outside tugs at the roof. The embers shift with a soft crack, and in that pause between warmth and frost, the first lesson of survival appears, not a story about kings or battles, but about wool wrapped close to the skin, and a stone held up to the light to read a sky no map could explain. Clothing came first, and the Vikings made it do most of the work. The way we make our thermostats do the work now and then brag about our energy savings. Their preferred fabric was wadmal, a dense, homespun wool cloth that behaved like a patient, fuzzy shield. It absorbed a little water, swelled, and then became stubbornly windproof, like a door that sticks just when you need to go outside. Under that, linen breathed. Over it, fur shrugged at weather. A simple trick wool against skin in the cold feels scratchy at first, and then becomes a small, portable climate. They wear layers with the same care most people use when packing groceries, so the bread doesn't end up beneath the apples. Mittens and socks were often stitched by nape binding, an older cousin of knitting that grows in small cone spirals. A single needle, a looping path, the sort of craft that makes time slow down until the snow, too, seems to move more gently. Boots were turned shoes, stitched inside out and flipped like a pancake. They were greased with tallow until they shone a respectful, slightly damp shine. If the day was very bad, and some days were exactly that, their outer capes might be felted or even waxed with pine pitch. Very little air got through, and what did was already tired. Because no one survives a northern winter alone, shelter was the second layer of clothing. Longhouses were not designed to be beautiful in drawings. They were designed to have corners where the wind gave up. Earth-fast posts, turf walls, a roof with patience. The central fire burned low and useful, making a column of smoke that knew its way out. Benches along the sides were beds at night and work tables by day, and if your neighbor's feet competed with your soup for attention, that was simply evidence of life. People slept in pairs, sometimes 3 to a bed, and discovered the ancient scientific truth that 2 bodies under 1 blanket generate exponentially more warmth than 1 sulking hero under 3. The walls stored heat the way a loaf keeps yesterday's sun for the morning toast. Soot drifted into the thatch, which sounds uncharming until you realize it kept the straw from rotting and sent insects to look for another dress. On especially bitter nights, families sat under shared bed curtains, the fabric equivalent of a fort made of chairs. Drafts were baffled, voices were muffled, and the fire could rest. That same slow, practical attitude guided their small daily chores. Snow, for example, was not so much an enemy as a filing system. Paths were stomped down and kept, and shoes gained overshoes, simple rawhide slipped over the sole, tied with a neat, unromantic knot. Even the hats had a routine. A cap pulled down low, a little iced rim forming at the edge of the breath, and every so often, A tap to release the frost like emptying crumbs from a pocket. A small pleasure, that tap. They noticed things we'd scroll past. The way the rime on a fence tells you the wind shifted at dawn. The sound of hooves in snow you can't yet see. The quiet victory of dry socks hung on a pole overnight. Close, but not too close to the embers, because patience dries better than haste. If you're counting, that is already 3 survival techniques wearing the clothing of chores. Out on the water, the techniques look like folk magic at first glance, and patient optics at second. The sea does not have road signs, but it does have polarization, which is a polite way of saying the sky hides patterns from impatient eyes. The Vikings sometimes used a sunstone, likely a piece of Iceland spar, a clear calcite that splits light into 2 ghost copies. You rotate the crystal until the 2 images of the sky match in brightness. The angle points toward the invisible sun behind cloud or fog. It is the sort of trick that rewards unhurried wrists. A sailor could do it with gloves on and a thought elsewhere. Add to that the everyday astronomy, counting the stars like old friends at a quiet party. The North Star, not because it is dramatic, but because it refuses to move. The arc of the sun in June, long and lazy, making the direction of home feel like a memory more than a bearing. They listened to waves the way we listen to air conditioners, mostly not at all, until something different happens. Swell from a distant storm is longer and slower. Local wind waves are choppy and close together. If the 2 patterns crisscrossed at a new angle, that meant a front was on the way. You tightened the line, you looked at the color of the horizon, you said almost nothing. Their ships were good listeners too. A Nair sat round-bellied in the water, more barge than blade, and made a steady platform for the ordinary business of not getting lost. The hull flexed slightly, as if it were a big cat stretching. The crew carried spare oars, lashed where they could be reached without theater. A small holdstone, really just a well-behaved rock, served as a sea, anchor to keep the bow obedient when the wind wanted to gossip with the stern. And the sail, patched deliberately, told its past right on its face. Here, a square of wadmel from a sister farm. There, a darker stripe where old pitch had become a kind of history. The rope, spun from walrus hide or twisted from bass fiber, was coiled in figure 8s so it wouldn't kink, a little gesture of kindness that every sailor understands. Somewhere in the gear, a spoon lived, because a hot drink is navigation for morale. Food for the voyage is where we quietly meet the impressive invention known as not dying of blandness. Dried fish stockfish was light, tough, and nearly immortal if kept dry. You could knock on it like a door. Before eating, it was beaten with a wooden hammer until it agreed to remember that it had once been a living thing. Then it went into broth or was chewed with butter the color of late afternoon. Meat could be kept in sour whey, a Viking brine with a polite tang. Barrels of barley behaved like savings accounts. Flatbread dried to the texture of a modest roof tile and came back to life with steam. A small miracle you perform with a lid and patience. Milk became skyer, which is not exactly cheese and not exactly yogurt, and exactly an excuse to feel cared for by a spoonful of something cool. For sweetening, there was honey and occasionally a bit of birch sap if the season insisted. And because a ship is a floating village, the crew shared a cask of ale that did not try to be heroic. It was a quiet ale that remembered everyone had work at dawn. Daily life ashore ran on a principle so broad you could embroider it on a cloak. Use everything twice if possible. An animal was not only meat. Bones turned into needles and skates and the handles of things that needed holding. Horn became cups, combs, and a kind of translucent window that let in winter light like a polite guest. Sinew, carefully teased apart, made thread with a memory for knots. Hide was leather, rawhide, parchment, lashings, shoes, snowshoe bindings, and the low, proud drum of a tent. Even the small leftover scraps had a job. Dipped in tallow, they were emergency candles with no illusions of grandeur. Fish gave their livers to lamps. The steady, slightly fishy flame is the smell of long evenings spent mending nets while stories get practice for the next winter. A whalebone could be a cutting board. A seal skin could be a float for a net. The logic is so steady it becomes almost musical. If you are still awake, you might be able to hum it. Plants joined the choir. Angelica grew tall and mild-tasting along rivers, and people chewed the stalks like soft pencils while traveling. Yarrow went into poultices because someone 1,000 years ago noticed that it helps a wound stop being dramatic. Birch bark was shaved for kindling and steeped for a tea that pretended not to be medicine. Pine resin sealed a leak, sealed a cut, and sealed a friendship if you shared it without being asked. Bog myrtle flavored ale, which may explain why some ales tasted pleasantly, like the idea of a forest. Juniper smoke touched meat. Heather filled mattresses and then was turned over when it learned too much about the past. A pocket full of dried thyme went on long journeys for company and for stews that smelled like someone cared enough to wait. Small hacks dotted the day. Urine was saved not as a prank but as a cleaning agent. The urea made a reliable laundry solution that took the smell out of wool and put stories into it. Soot mixed with animal fat made a workable blacking for boots. A strip of woven wool, wrapped around the lower legs under the trousers, kept snow from sneaking in with ideas above its station. These were called puttees long before that word was borrowed elsewhere. If you wanted to sharpen a knife at sea, you used a small portable whetstone that hung from your belt like a gray lozenge. Many of these stones were imported from Norway because the stone there behaved well, proving that even the Vikings outsourced when it was sensible. Children learned to twist cordage while counting aloud, as if the numbers themselves became strands. By the time they were 10, their fingers were little rope walks. Endurance wasn't an event, it was curriculum. From childhood, people learned the soft arts of discomfort, cold water washing on Lagerdager washing day, which still sits quietly in modern calendars, long walks with a pack that contained less than you wanted and exactly what you needed, and the ability to nap near a door that opened too often. Wrestling taught where your center of gravity keeps its wallet. Swimming taught what to do when the river is not impressed by your plans. Real training looked like chores scaled up. Carry this, mend that, stand watch, say little. It turns out that going without complaint is a skill you can practice like archery. Even feasting had a survival motive. Community calories pile up in bodies and in loyalty, which is just stored help. A good host survived winter in 2 ways, by feeding others then, and by being remembered when February felt unreasonably long. Communal warmth was not only a statistic from the Longhouse. Winter games included storytelling with laugh lines that knew better than to wake the baby. The local assembly, the thing solved disputes slowly, in an atmosphere that could be described as briskly patient. Agreements were public and therefore self-heating. If someone promised to bring timber in spring, 50 ears heard it, and the promise itself became a kind of fuel. Gift-giving created little thermal loops between families. A cloak moved from one shoulder to another and took loyalty along like a portable hearth. Even hospitality had a clever edge. The more people who owed you a meal, the more doors you could knock on when the wind used all the words it knew. Trust in a climate like that is as practical as mittens. Belief added the last layer, the one closest to the skin. A story about Valhalla, told at the end of a punishing day, does a neat thing to the human nervous system. It reframes hardship as training instead of suffering. If your knuckles are cold, you can tell yourself that they are learning to be small shields. If the sea looks like the inside of a forged blade, you can whisper to Ran, the sea goddess, and tie an extra line of theological double knot. Not everyone believed the same details. Some thought of Christ's fishermen, some of Odin's ravens, some of nothing at all beyond the fact that dawn was happening again. But the scaffolding of meaning let people carry loads with fewer complaints per mile, which is a survival technique rarely listed on museum labels. Rituals were small and therefore doable. A piece of bread for the spirits of the house placed on a beam. A carved mark on the mast for luck. A quiet, let it be so before launching. The result is less fear, which is as warming as a second cloak. If you have ever stood outside on a cold night and noticed how sound travels farther, you will understand why the Vikings designed their lives to whisper. Quiet systems endure. A stove that burns slowly. A sail that prefers steady wind to drama. A community that does not spend courage unless the receipt of necessity is stapled to it. Their genius lay in accumulating ordinary margins. A garment that does two jobs. A house that collects yesterday's heat and lends it to tomorrow. A ship that tells you what the weather is doing, simply by how its timbers talk. Even boredom had work to do. Long tasks carding wool, scraping hides, counting fish trained attention to ride the waves of time without seasickness. That same attention, on a gray day at sea when the sun was just a rumor behind cloud, might be the difference between steering a degree too far and arriving, wet and relieved, at a known shore. Navigation without maps sounds theatrical until you see how much of it is just kindness to your future self. You remember the smell of kelp that always floats near a certain headland. You watch birds. Kittiwakes mean open water, eiders mean coast, and a flock headed decisively in one direction close to dusk means there is a roost there, whether your chart owns it or not. You keep the sounder line tidy, knotting little markers at fathom intervals so your hands can measure by touch in the dark. You create a mental corridor from reef to reef and add a note in your head. After the second shallow, turn to where the swell feels lazier. Future you will be grateful, and gratitude is another way to be warm. Preserving food can be described with unglamorous chemistry. Salt pulls water out of fish so bacteria have less to gossip in. Smoke adds phenols that behave like small, polite security guards. Lactobacilli do the pickling in whey, lowering pH until most spoilage microbes decide to try their luck elsewhere. Grain stays grain if it stays dry. It turns into hope if you malt it and brew a little ale from time to time for the calories that flow. If a barrel leaks, you swell the staves with hot water and then tap along the seams with the gentle rhythm of someone who has learned that force is expensive and patience is free. On long voyages, a favorite trick was to hang a netted bag of dried meat above the cooking pot so it softened slowly in the steam, like a small cloud being convinced to be soup. No recipe card required. Herbal knowledge did not announce itself with trumpets. It lived in walled gardens and in the crease of a grandmother's palm. Meadowsweet for aches, willow for the same reason with a slightly bitter face. Ducks for nettle stings because it is efficient to grow the antidote next to the lesson. Plantain leaves as bandages, soft as reasonable advice. In summer, greens were eaten because winter was already counting them. In winter, dried greens turned up in broths as if the meadow had agreed to visit. The most powerful substance of all may have been time. Wounds were cleaned not by magic but by attention, and a clean cloth was often the difference between infection and a bad story that never got told. Perhaps the most overlooked survival technique is the pace itself. The Vikings moved at the speed of wool drying by the hearth, of a keel being shaped with an adze, of dough rising under a board with a weight on it. They knew when to hurry, when a storm suddenly offered a clear run home, and when hurrying would only create future repair work. In the sagas, the heroes are loud, but the world that supported them is built by quiet experts in the art of not wasting anything, least of all steadiness. You put your cloak on a peg at night so it is not damp with floor frost in the morning. You store a spare pair of mittens in the prow because cold is forgetful. You mark your spoon with a notch so it comes back to you, and somehow life comes back with it. There is a last modest trick I should mention before you drift. It concerns fires. A Viking hearth was not only heat, it was information. If the smoke crawled along the rafters before finding the smoke hole, it meant the outside air was heavy with weather. If sparks clung to the log ends, the wood was green, and the day would need extra patience. People learned these small languages because they lived beside them. The result was a house that could be read at dawn, like a newspaper, a ship that could be read at noon, like a weather report, a sky that could be read at midnight, like a letter from a friend whose handwriting, you know. Very few of these skills are noisy. Most are just there, the way the North Star is there, ordinary and exact, even when clouds pretend otherwise. So the rock that finds the sun matters. The wool that makes its own little climate matters. The longhouse that has room for the sound of rain on turf matters. The barrel that waits all winter without sulking matters. You notice, you adjust, you don't hurry more than you must. A technique is often only a habit with a good memory, and the wind, which has seen all of this before, goes on talking in the doorway while you sit a little closer to the fire, and the ladle dips one more time, and the night becomes less of an event and more of a place to live in, long enough for your eyes to close. You might not expect a strip of wool the width of 2 thumbs and a slippery stone that pretends to be a chunk of ice to explain how people stayed alive at the top of the map, yet here we are. The wool is for holding on to heat as if it were a shy house cat. The stone is for locating a sun that has wandered off behind a cloud and refuses to leave a forwarding address. Taken together, the two are less a survival kit and more a lifestyle, which in the far north meant learning to be politely stubborn. If you remain awake long enough to hear the phrase tablet woven etching, you're welcome to subscribe. If you drift off before I reach soured way, your sleep is the better choice, and the Vikings would approve of the efficiency. The day began with clothing, which is the quietest technology. Cloth was not simply worn, it was engineered on a farm. Sheep produced wool with personality. The coarser outer fibers gave weather armor. The softer underdown became comfort with ambitions. Women spun on drop spindles that turned like slow planets. A spindle whirl from a beach pebble added heft and the authority of gravity. On the loom, warp threads stood obedient as fence posts while the weft walked through them in calm rows. The result, wadmal, was cloth dense enough to soften the wind's opinions. Tunics and gowns were cut with economy so that edges could be finished by tablet weaving, narrow bands braided on small cards with holes in the corners. Tablet woven borders behave like seatbelts for seams and like jewelry for people who preferred their ornaments to do something useful. Under wool came linen, smooth as the inside of a shell. Over wool came fur, not for glamour, but for the way hair traps hair, which is really just domesticated weather. Mittens grew by nape binding, a looping technique older than knitting that refuses to unravel when snagged. One needle, one thread, infinite patience. Socks followed the same spiral, and if you've never considered patience a foot-warming device, the North invites you to reconsider. Leg wraps spiraled up the shins to keep snow out of boots while in arguments against drifts. Boots themselves were turned shoes sewn inside out and then flipped, like a good idea that finally sees daylight. A smear of tallow or fish oil taught them to shed wet. Someone always remembered to keep a spare pair of insoles near the hearth, because dry feet are less a luxury than a policy. Shelter was clothing scaled up. A longhouse had a turf skin over a timber skeleton, with birch bark in between, behaving like a quiet tree that kept water where it belonged. Driftwood ribs, precious as imported books, bent to the curve of the roof because real trees were a rumor in many places. The smoke hole, the lorry knew its place above the central fire, a patient orange machine whose fuel had once measured years in a stand of birch. Along the walls, box beds with little doors made private weather. You shut the panel and your breath warmed your own small room inside the room. Moss sealed gaps in the walls with the smug efficiency of something that also insulates birds' nests. Even the floor joined the conspiracy. A layer of stamped earth held yesterday's heat just long enough for today to say thank you. If a storm arrived with the long manners of February, people moved closer, shared benches, and turned human metabolism into infrastructure. The work of the house admired slowness. Porridge absorbed water the way a field absorbs rain, and no one hurried it. Wet mittens steamed on a pole above the coals, close enough to remember fire, far enough to avoid becoming a cautionary tale. A bench sloped slightly toward the wall so bowls didn't wander. Tallow candles guttered with a reliable humility that made the hours visible without pretending they were more than they were. Children learned the weather by listening to the roof. Hard sleet sounded like unenthusiastic applause, fine snow like soft sweeping. If this sounds like a lullaby, that is because, in winter, the house itself tried to sing you into a state of acceptable patience. At sea, patience became a tool with a handle. The sky above the North Atlantic is often a curtain that forgot it was supposed to open. For that, someone kept a crystal, probably Iceland spar, tucked into a pocket. When you rotate the stone and the twin images inside match in brightness, the polarized light quietly points to the hidden sun. A crewman could do it one-handed while holding bread with the other, which made it exactly the right level of impressive. The undertucked sun compass, a small wooden disc with incised marks, did a similar favor at noon. You set the gnomon, read a shadow, and the ship slipped along an invisible line with the unhurried confidence of a cart following ruts. Stars joined the meeting when clouds retreated. The North Star provided the one gift nobody returns: reliability. Ursa Major acted as a crooked finger pointing at it. Orion took winter attendance. Birds helped during the day. Fulmars meant open water. Eiders meant nearshore feeding. And a line of kiwakes heading inland toward evening suggested a ledge or river mouth worth remembering. The sea itself offered maps to anyone willing to touch them. A lead line rope, knotted at fathoms with a lump of tallow pressed into the sinker, brought up sand, shell, or mud, a little geological postcard from the bottom. A long, slow swell announced mother far away. Short, choppy waves argued about what was happening nearby. You steered between arguments. Food for voyages was less cuisine than time management. Stockfish was caught or haddock dried until it forgot it had been soft. Before eating, you beat it with a wooden mallet, a gesture not of violence, but of persuasion. Soaked and simmered, it agreed to cooperate with butter. Barrels held barley that had only two moods, raw or cooked, and both made sense. Flatbread was rolled thin as an opinion, baked till crisp, and stacked in tall, patient piles that looked like architecture and lasted almost as long. Butter salted itself into a yellow fossil and waited for a knife. Skyr, a cultured dairy product that pretends not to be cheese, rode in tubs with the dignity of an elder. Sour waste scrub pickled meat in a way that kept flavor while banishing trouble. A small cask of ale did not chase courage. It fed calories to the next hour's work. On land, survival techniques dissolved into routine so thoroughly that they only looked like tricks to outsiders. Animals were biographies bound in many formats. Meat was only the first chapter. Hides made shoes and straps and the forgiving lids of boxes. Rawhide became lashings that tightened as they dried, the most dependable mood swing in material culture. Horn turned into cups, combs, and translucent window panes thin as patience. Sinew separated into threads with a memory for knots. Bones straightened into needles, toggles, and gaming pieces that entertained without demanding applause. Even hooves signed up for duty as glue, proving that usefulness is a spectrum with a sticky end. The leftover little bits, coaxed into tallow dips, became emergency lamps whose light looked like sensible decisions. The fishing grounds insisted on similar thrift. Nets were stone sinkers and floats made from hollow bones, or inflated seal bladders that bobbed on chalk with a modesty you only notice once you miss it. A spare oar clamped into a notch could serve as a jury rudder if something large and anonymous objected to your plans. Seal skins, sewn tight, became watertight bags for delicate cargo like salt that disliked making friends with the ocean. Whale ribs turned into sled runners with a curve that understood snow. A bit of walrus hide cut into long thongs made lines stout enough to argue with a heavy fish and kind enough to the hands that held them. Plants, too, filled the quiet pharmacy. Yarrow helped blood remember it had better places to be. Willow bark, slightly bitter and slightly miraculous, soothed aches the way a good chair does by being present. Plantain leaves declared themselves bandages and then kept the promise. Angelica was chewed as a traveler's companion that happened to grow near rivers, exactly where a traveler would meet it. Bog myrtle scented ale and discouraged insects, which is the herbal version of a 2-for-1. And mattress sticks, dried heather modeled a supportive attitude and then asked to be shaken out and refilled. A schedule that kept both bedding and conversation fresh. Birch bark brewed into tea that tasted like politely wooded water and acted like a tonic for spirits that had spent too long indoors. Some remedies were more about attention than chemistry. A wound washed in boiled water, covered with a clean wool pad, and inspected twice a day, often healed, as if the gods had signed the bandage. Smoke from juniper cleansed the indoor air with a smell halfway between forest and good intentions. In summer, a salve of goose fat and crushed herbs, soft, weathered hands until they resembled hands again. In winter, the same fat stored in a lidded pot became lamp fuel, and the year's sunlight returned a little at a time in the wick as slow retelling. The trading for hardship that made all this look easy began early and without fanfare. Children carried small loads in oversized bags, as if practice were a game that did useful chores on the side. They learned Glyma, the native wrestling that teaches where balance sleeps. They skied on wooden boards curved up at the tips with a stringy, homemade wax of pine tar rubbed in by palm and optimism. Sledges taught the art of steering with hips. Swimming lessons happened in lakes that had recently been ice. You learned to breathe as if you meant it. Work songs kept pace when hands were busy and minds wanted to be elsewhere. The body absorbed the idea that endurance is a collection of small, boring choices made early. Even leisure had a training plan hidden under the tablecloth. Nat Liker, the ball game, made sprinting and dodging feel like entertainment rather than insurance. Long-distance walking in summer mapped every ridge and stream into memory, so that winter's white sheet still hid a terrain you could picture with your eyes closed. At the thing, the local assembly, speaking your mind in measured words exercised a different set of muscles, the ones that hold a community together when weather tries to pry it apart. On feast days, everything caloric went through a brief, ceremonial expansion, and then stores contracted back into barrels and bins with the satisfaction of systems that know they are still adequate. The last layer was belief, worn next to the skin where it could keep the rest of the layers company. Luck Hammond Duran and families like a grandmother's recipe, borrowable and enhanced by good behavior. Oath rings on a chieftain's high seat collected promises the way a meadow collects dew. The shrine was communal honor. Runes marked a beam or a blade, not as spells that bullied the world, but as reminders that attention is a kind of protection. Offerings to Landbitter, the spirits of place, were modest: bread, beer, a nod, and in return the hill. The shore and the field felt slightly more like allies. When things went wrong, a person might tell themselves that the failure was training for a haul later on, whether they imagined it with benches under Audena's roof or the patient company of saints along a different road. Either way, meaning put a lining in the coat. On bad nights at sea, someone quietly invoked Ran, the sea's demanding hostess, and tied the extra knot anyway. On good mornings on land, someone thanked the house beam for not cracking under snow. When a journey began, travelers touched the prow with a calm superstition that says, "I have done my portion. Let the water do its portion." The rituals were small because small things fit into every day, and the accumulation of small things is the least traumatic road to survival ever paved, and therefore the best kind for wearing to sleep. If you tilt your ear to these techniques, you hear a rhythm. Layer wool, close the bed door, raid the sky through crystal, beat the fish, save the scraps, boil the water, stretch the step, keep the promise, whisper the charm, repeat. Nothing here is glamorous, and that is the point. Glamour freezes. Wool steams. A sunstone does not shout, it clarifies. Sour whey does not impress guests. It sees spring. When a tool broke, the repair was part of the story, stitched there by someone who also had to stir the porridge. When a sailor guessed the sun's position, the guess was simply another stitch. Far from being heroic, the techniques are comforting in their insistence that the world can be handled with a tidy rope and attention paid at the right time. A ship's coil lays in figure 8 so it won't kink. A hearth log is turned to burn clean. A cloak is hung on the peg you always use so morning doesn't you begin with a search. These are not tricks, they are manners directed at the universe. And manners, surprisingly, are effective insulation. Sooner or later, the longhouse dimmed. Fat burned with the patient expression shared by lamps and elders. Someone said, as people always did, that tomorrow looked workable. On the bench, a mended mitten cooled into its shape. Outside, the snow practiced landing. The sky, which had spent an entire afternoon refusing to admit the position of the sun, lifted its clouded eyebrows and turned into a proper night. Somewhere in a pocket lay a small crystal. Somewhere on a peg hung a woolen band you could wrap twice around your wrist during the first cold chore. The house exhaled. The people who had built it exhaled. And if you are drifting now, that, too, is a technique. The art of letting a long day become a shorter one without argument, while the fire hums the practical song that carries on whether we listen or not. You might not expect a loaf of bread to be measured by the length of someone's forearm, yet markets once rose and fell by elbows. An ell here, a cubit there, a foot that belonged suspiciously to a long-shot official. Everyone bought and sold with lengths that were also people. It is a gentle kind of chaos, like organizing your pantry by the sound jars make when tapped. If you're still awake when we reach the ceremonial weighing of cheese with a bronze duck, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the notion drift past like steam from a kettle. Nothing tonight requires quickness. We will only follow measuring sticks through their quietly determined lives. A day in an old town square began with the bell and the broom and the stick. The bell told the hour no one had agreed on. The broom collected yesterday into a neat line, and the stick and ell wand with its small notches and proud brass tips reminded everyone how much cloth counted as a yard before breakfast. A draper leaned the wand against the counter the way sailors lean oars against a wall, unconsciously, as if the wood needed company. Cloth lay in patient folds. The seller pulled the bolt across the bench, adjusted the selvage like a good collar, and aligned the first notch with a table edge. The stick told a number without speaking. The buyer did not argue with the wood. She did, however, watch the angle, because a diagonal measurement is as flattering to fabric as it is to stories. The merchant, in turn, watched the watcher, and the elder in the corner watched them both, for the public peace of measurement is maintained by a very mild mutual suspicion that eventually becomes tradition. Bread had its own arithmetic. A town's assize fixed the price and the weight, and when grain grew dear, the loaf grew small in a way that tried to look dignified. Inspectors often called ale conners for beer and something less operatic for bread-carried scales that squeaked like wooden opinions. They shaved a heel from a loaf, weighed it against a cluster of little brass discs, and nodded in the universal language of close enough. Somewhere in the square, a huckster declared that her eggs were as big as St. Peter's thumb, which is a measurement that means precisely nothing and somehow sells a dozen. Meanwhile, a boy tasked with fetching salt paced the stone gutter with steps he had been told were a man's yard. which he would later discover was not a transferable unit. The world ran on handfuls, pinches, ells, and fathoms, and each one carried a biography. A fathom was literally an embrace of rope, 2 arms open to their day's widest hope. Sailors measured with gestures. A league was a distance you could walk without testing your boots. A barleycorn, the seed itself, defined early shoe sizes with the democratic certainty of agriculture. In the apothecary, a dram was a sigh disguised as a spoonful, and a scruple, which sounds moral, was exactly 20 grains plus the patience it took to count them. In winter, when daylight was rationed like honey, candle clocks burned an hour into the air and left it curled in wax strips that looked like advice. Behind the public display of sticks and scales sat a room that functioned like a chorus with lower voices, the town hall, or the guild chamber, where master measures lived. Locked in a chest, wrapped in cloth, they were taken out on inspection days with the reverence usually reserved for relics or very old cats. A bronze L-rod, notched at the shoulder of the standard, caught light in a way that made arguments seem impolite. A nest of nesting cups, each a little bronze bowl stepping down toward thimble size, agreed with one another more consistently than neighbors usually do. Standard stones for the scale, stamped with a crown mark, lay heavy and well-meaning. When the chest opened, the market's many slightly different realities collapsed into this one gentle brass authority. A clerk with a quill like a narrow bird recorded the ritual, which proceeded at the pace of careful handwriting. The inspector compared the baker's pound to the town's pound. He added a shaving to this one, filed a whisper off that one, blew metal dust from his fingers like a minor weather event, and then wrote "good" in a hand that leaned forward modestly. The ale cunner, who wore thick leather breeches less by tradition than by practicality, kneeled to test a cask, dabbed beer onto a wooden bench, and sat, rising with a small damp ring that announced the cask still leaked. This was considered both science and modest theater. Woe to the brewer whose barrel failed to wet an official in the proper way. The tools themselves had personalities. The L wand was brisk. The bushel basket, woven of split oak, was a homebody who liked to be filled evenly, struck level with a straight edge, the strickle, and never heaped except on feast days. The Steelyard scale, with its sliding weight along a notched arm, behaved like a seesaw that preferred truth. You hooked a ham on one end, nudged the poise along its track, and watched the arm level with the tender relief of equilibrium. In the pharmacy, a set of balance pans suspended from a central tongue trembled a little before deciding. The moment when both pans rested was called, with great satisfaction, quiet. Civic buildings wrote this quiet into stone. In many towns, a standard L or yard was carved right into the wall, so travelers could calibrate their wands, and no one had to accuse anyone of optimism. You could hold your stick against the street itself and learn your future in cloth. Above the mark, a Latin inscription admired uniformity, the way a cat admires a sun patch, without committing to help maintain it. These fixed measures weathered rain and politics with equal indifference. Generations of hands polished the groove where wood met stone. You can still see the shine in places, which is a very slow kind of applause. For all the seriousness, belief, and superstition traveled alongside like helpful cousins. The moon inspired farmers to sow seeds when the calendar felt theoretical. The swollen or slender disk in the sky served as a unit of opportunity. Fishmongers swore that salt measured by the handful worked better than salt measured by weight, because the sea recognized the human shape. Bakers tapped loaves to listen for a hollow sound that equaled done, a percussion metric that ignored the scale entirely. On pilgrimage roads, travelers measured progress in paternosters, rosary beads falling one by one through fingers until a wayside shrine arrived with the inevitability of arithmetic. Kings and councils, who adored neatness in theory, tried to gather these many customs under a single hat. Charters proclaimed that there should be one weight, one measure, one bread, one ale throughout the realm, which is a lovely sentence and not something you can actually put in your pocket. Merchants listened and then returned to their benches where wands, baskets, and scales had local accents. The Magna Carta included a clause about uniform measures, and England nodded in the manner of a person who promises to get organized on Monday. France periodically standardized everything with revolutionary enthusiasm, and then gently reopened the old, just to let out a familiar pound and a forgiving pint. Empires are tidy on paper and homespun in practice. Still, order had a champion in the traveling inspector, the gauger, the sealer, the meter man, who arrived with a satchel of little stamps. He pressed his seal into pewter plates to say the metal was honest, and into wooden measures to swear the volume was as promised. The stamp usually showed a crown or a city symbol, or an initial with more self-confidence than ink deserves. Stamp things felt safe, like doors with two latches. People watched the inspector at work with mild interest, the way one watches shoes being resoled, grateful that someone knows how, relieved not to do it oneself, already thinking about supper. Sometimes the philosophy of measurement took a cozy, almost monastic form. Monks kept time by canonical hours organized around prayer, measured by sunlight's personality. Vigils stretched like wool. Prime stitched the day together, Compline folded it away. Water clocks in cloisters stripped the same measurement in every season, and sand clocks turned patience into a resource you could spend. A candle marked with lines 1 inch per hour burned for a meeting, and when the line disappeared, so did the debate. In the great houses, tapestries were measured in ells but discussed in winters, because decoration is also insulation, and nobody hangs warmth on walls without counting how much of it is needed. The geometry of trade routes produced its own arithmetic. A day's travel by wagon equaled about 20 to 30 kilometers, a unit called "we'll get there," which depends heavily on mud. Rivers offered leagues that stretched and contracted with current. Ferrymen charged by foot or by load or by the ferret, if rumor in a single medieval marginal note can be believed. If you're smiling at the ferret tariff, that is the right response. In ports, a ton was not a weight but a ton, a cask full of something that had once been grapes and was now geography. Dockside cranes creaked toward balance like large birds seeking a branch, and when the hook settled, the ledger settled with it. Even warfare, which tries to be grand, adopted homely measures because no one can fight long with ambiguities in the soup. Rations were counted by mouth, by mess, by ladle. Tents were spaced by paces. A signal fire in the next valley was 2 hills away, which is not a standard measure unless you have those exact hills, which fortunately armies do. The width of a road determined how many carts could pass, and thus how unstuck a supply line remained. Somewhere a straight edge decided policy. Standardization in the modern sense arrived like a guest who knocks softly and then rearranges the furniture. Scientists who love peace with numbers proposed metric units that belong to no one's body, and therefore to everyone's, the meter's noble origin a fraction of the planet. S meridian did not stop it from being as practical as an umbrella. The kilogram found a home in a platinum iridium cylinder under glass, a little moon with anxieties about dust. Fields converted slowly. In one orchard, the ladder remained 12 rungs, and you'll need the 13th, which is a perfectly good measure as long as you also bring a rope. Railways confronted gauges, how far apart rails should be, like tailors confronting inseams. Standard gauge won patient arguments by promising fewer delays and more sandwiches eaten on time. A wider or narrower gauge looked elegant in its own country and moody at the border. Telegraph operators measured words by rate card and emotion by pauses. Post offices counted distance in zones and affection in stamps. Even money, which pretends to be universal, traveled with exchange tables that folded into wallets. In every case, the new order perched lightly on the old habits, like a precise hat on a weatherproof head. Museums now cradle many of these old measures. You can stand in front of a bushel with iron hoops and imagine grain falling into it like small decisions. You can see an L wand and note that the brass tip was not decoration but armor against a lifetime of counters. A set of nested apothecary weights, each stamped with a lion or a letter, sits like a metallic family reunion grandfather ounce at the back, timid grain up front. The labels tell stories. The objects tell schedules. You understand suddenly why the clerk's handwriting leaned forward. The line itself was a measurement of time, unspooling across the page. In the workshop of a modern instrument maker, the heir to all this wood and brass, you'll find digital calipers that hum to themselves in zeros and ones, micrometers that pinch gently, and reference blocks that are ground so flat they cling together out of politeness. There's a ritual here too. You wipe the gauge faces with a lint-free cloth that looks like formality but is simply smart. You check zero, you make the measurement, you check zero again. The old L warden would recognize the rhythm, if not the vocabulary. Accuracy remains a slow conversation between a tool and a person, with the object waiting patiently to be included. What did the old measures teach that remains hard to replace? Perhaps that trust is granular. A town believed in its brass owl because everyone saw it, occasionally touched it, and quietly agreed to be bound by it. People became standards for one another, not by perfection, but by predictable error. Mistress A's yard ran a hair long. Master B's scales leaned a whisper to the left. The differences canceled, or at least harmonized, like instruments tuning in a pit before the play. The result was not exact, but workable, which is a very dignified kind of success. Our eyes still accept a carpenter's pencil mark more willingly than an abstract number. You can point at a line and say, here. It is tempting to hunt for drama in these sticks and stones, to find the moment when uniformity triumphed and life snapped into crisp focus, but measurement rarely wins. It accumulates. Someone straightens a string, someone tightens a weight, someone sharpens the chalk. A notch deepens with use, a groove darkens with handling. A bell's strike becomes the hour by repetition rather than decree. That patience is the lullaby of the practical world. It asks nothing, it simply goes on. If you're drifting now, imagine a market closing. The L wand slides into its niche. The scales hang quiet, their tongues level, their pans reflecting a small piece of ceiling. The sealed measures return to their chest with the contentment of tools that have been ordinary all day. The clerk sands a last line of ink and blows the grit with more ceremony than the words deserve. On a step in the square, two stones that have been used as counterweights all afternoon settle into the impossible exactness of evening. Somewhere, a candle burns down to the hour with a soft hiss that sounds like agreement. And if sleep presses its gentle stamp on your eyelids, that too is a measure one that says the day has reached enough. And the ledger can be closed without totals, because the numbers already know where they live. You might not expect a piece of smoky quartz to help someone find west in a fog thick enough to butter, but the Vikings allegedly carried a crystal for that very purpose, turning the sky into a quiet compass, even when the sun kept secrets. It is the sort of fact that slides into the mind like a smooth pebble into a pocket, cool, small, entirely unhurried. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part about drying fish by the meter, you can subscribe if you like, or simply let your attention wander off to nap in a comfortable corner. We will move at the speed of wool shrinking by the fire, which is to say, slowly, steadily, and with a certain humility that sweaters understand. Before a Viking went anywhere, he put on the north. Clothing was geography you could wear. First came skin and patience, then linen, then wool, then more wool, and finally the conversational trim of fur that said both cold and practical vanity. Nail-bound socks, made with a looping technique so durable that time itself seems to bounce off it, waded inside shoes that smelled faintly of seal grease and pine smoke. Foot straps stood in for socks when the laundry was frozen stiff. Birch bark insoles turned shoes into small private floors. Trousers of heavy wadmal held their shape like polite opinions, and tunics fell to mid-thigh with the rhythm of rowing songs stitched right into the hem. A hooded cloak, clasped with a pin that could double as a tool, made the body into a small house. Mittens were sometimes connected by a cord, not because Vikings were childish, but because the wind could unfriend anything. Fur was not a luxury. It was insulation with ideas. The outer layer turned away sleet the way a good thought turns away impatience. You could inhale near a sleeve and hear the muffled sound of weaving keeping promises. Shelter continued this conversation with the weather. Houses were turf over timber, with the emphasis, interestingly, on the turf. A longhouse looked part meadow, part ship, and entirely committed to staying put. Thick sod walls kept winter out and summer in, which is how all walls wish to be remembered. A central fire gave heat a place to exist in public, while smoke climbed toward a louvered opening and then changed its mind. Smoke cured rafters to the color of strong tea and preserved fish hanging from the beams, so supper simply became thicker air over time. Benches along the walls did double duty as seats, beds, and storage for quiet objects that didn't mind being sat upon. In many houses, the animals lived in their own end of the structure. Cows radiated warmth into the human rooms like compliant radiators with hooves. The floor preferred straw. The walls preferred patience. In a blizzard, the house's roof disappeared into the land, and the entrance became a decision you made with your hands as well as your feet. A door opened inward to keep drifting snow from negotiating house rules. A small oil lamp made from soapstone cast a light that could never be mistaken for noon. Soot gathered in corners the way stories gather after supper, reluctant to leave. Everything hummed with the communal heat of bodies, fire, and stew, a scientific arrangement sometimes known as many solutions in one room. Out on the water, survival was not an event, but a habit composed of small thoughts repeated often. Without printed charts, the sea read itself aloud. A practiced rower listened with his hands. Swell from the open ocean rolled slow and heavy, while local wind chops stuttered at the knuckles. Birds wrote paragraphs in the air about nearby land. Kittiwakes drafted their footnotes around cliffs. The color of water taught vocabulary. Green hinted at shoals, still blue at depth, brown at river mouths that came down from somewhere someone remembered. A steering oar kept its own logbook in the wrist, noting yaw and set and the mutter of crosswinds. The sun shadow board, a small disc with a peg told latitude by measuring the peg's shadow at midday. It was a pocket sundial that said, gently, you are here, and meant it. Sailors sometimes carried a chunk of Iceland spar, a transparent crystal that splits light into twins. Rotate it until the heavens stop arguing, and the sun confesses its location behind cloud. It is, in a way, the first polarized sunglasses, except you hold them to the sky and not to your face, and you look clever while doing it. At night, the stars arrange themselves like nails in an enormous black plank, and if you could keep the North Star over the same plank gap for long enough, you ended up in the right fjord with the quiet satisfaction of accurate furniture. Food on these voyages behaved like another crewmate, one who spoke rarely and kept people alive. Fish were dried into a philosophy, split, desalted by North Atlantic honesty, and hung on racks that clattered in the wind. Cod became stockfish light, resistant to time, and as thrilling as chalk. A man could tap one against a deck and think deep thoughts on nutrition while his teeth prepared for work. Flatbread baked so thin that it might as well have been a platonic idea. Mead sailed in barrels that understood expansion and contraction, the staves swelling with the weather, iron hoops putting their arms around the day. Barley porridge attended every meal with an attendance record no scholar achieves. Salted meat curled in casks like quiet punctuation, moderate and useful. Honey kept bacteria polite. Skyr, a cultured dairy cousin to yogurt, waited in skin bags and felt no particular hurry. Sour whey pickled things that needed to last longer than memory. Even water untrustworthy in casks, if left to remember pond life traveled better as small beer, which is exactly what it sounds like. Domestic, gentle, more hydration than celebration. A ship kept bits of tallow for lamps, cups nested inside one another like family, and a shared knife that could answer every question except why someone kept hiding the good spoon. On land, thrift stretched across creatures until it became a skill all by itself. A single reindeer was a hardware store. Hide became boots, coats, and tent panels that turned wind from an enemy into a second cousin. Sinew teased apart into long, resistant fibers, stitched shoes and bound arrowheads with the quiet competence of thread that remembers trees. Bones answered to names like awl, needle, and handle. Antler became combs, buttons, and the sort of gaming pieces one loses with legendary speed. Horn, wormed and flattened, turned into translucent windows that did not break so much as decide to change shape over time. Hooves simmered into glue that held thoughts together in bad weather. Brains tan leather, which proves that intelligence can be practical in ways schools seldom test. Intestines became sausage casings, which is the culinary equivalent of a good second act. Bladders made serviceable water skins. If that makes you blink, remember that glass breaks and winter does not ask permission. Whale ribs, when fate and shoreline provided them, supported roofs like the idea of a cathedral passing through a coastal village and leaving an autograph. In a pinch, shoulder blades improvised as shovels, and if you doubt it, try scooping snow with a book and see if this paragraph gains credibility. The plant world stood close by, holding remedies that smelled like hills and tasted like practical magic. Willow bark, the ancestor of aspirin, offered relief that was politely bitter. Yarrow encouraged wounds to close with the persuasive power of astringency. Its leaves looked like feathery advice. Angelica grew tall and emphatic in northern gardens, a survival celebrity you could chew, brew, and bless. Even the seed heads looked like diagrams of usefulness. Juniper smoke flavored me and made rooms smell like the clean part of a forest. Birch bark surrendered tar to careful fires, and that tar sealed boats, soothed skin, and glued solace. Iceland moss, which is actually a lichen, became soup when patience was added, and if you are unconvinced, remember that the goal of soup is not astonishment. Nettles turned into spring greens once they met boiling water and forgiveness. Dulse and other seaweeds dried into snacks that tasted exactly like the place they were from. Pine needles brewed into a tea with more vitamin C than its look would suggest. It is the least dramatic way a tree can save a life. When the wind put salt on your lips and your hands were full of rope, a mouthful of hot plant water could feel like a small treaty with winter. Fire cooperated with all this without taking credit. Tinder fungus amadou lifted a spark from flint and steel and nursed it into a coal with the patience of a good listener. A coal rolled into a nest of dry grass, and the nest became flame, and flame became stew, and stew became the reason a day turned into evening. Pine pitch made torches, and torches made work possible after the sun announced it had other plans. Lamps burned fish oil with a flame that moved like a slow thought. On sled trips, embers were carried in leaded boxes so that tomorrow would not have to start from zero. Even the act of banked coals under ash taught restraint. Fire was rarely large. It was continuous, like the letter that becomes a word because someone refuses to lift the pen. Children learned all this by approach and repetition. Games were not really games, but rehearsals disguised as fun. Sliding on bone skates taught balance, and balance taught how to stay on a heaving deck. Tug of war taught the angle of force and the warmth of teamwork. Snowball fights taught trajectories you could feel in your shoulder blades. Carrying water taught the smooth, economical walk that wastes neither steps nor story. Cold water plunges taught the body to negotiate with icy rivers while adults looked on and pretended not to remember their own first gasp. A child turned chores into knowledge with the unpublicized efficiency of youth. You held the oar and learned the song. You stirred the porridge and learned the clock. You fed the animals and learned the diplomacy of horns. None of it was urgent. All of it was continuous. Communities rehearsed resilience the way choirs rehearse hymns, by standing next to one another and singing until agreement became the most natural note. The local assembly, was governance with boots on. People argued, stood, paused, and counted the sheep while waiting their turn. Disputes were resolved by memory, oath, and the peculiar gravity of standing stones. Winter feasts converted scarcity into choreography. One household had barley, another a pig, a third the skill of turning smoke into flavor. Rope-making bees braided strength from many hands. Boat repair days ended with everyone's thumbs smelling of tar and satisfaction. When storms ransacked boats, neighbors became inventory. A broken mast leaned against a wall that understood. It is difficult to dramatize cooperation, and that is why it works so well. Inside these habits ran a quiet river of belief. A small amulet shaped like Thor's hammer lay warm against the skin. Not because it could stop lightning, that job belongs to tall trees, but because courage sometimes needs a place to park. Fate or word was not a script. It was whether you dressed for. If you died bravely, the Suri said, you would dine in Valhalla and talk about it afterward to appreciative company. This odd promise, half poetry and half morale policy, did not make people reckless. It made them calm. When the sea stood up and explained itself too loudly, a sailor adjusted the sail without asking for applause. The dead were often set into the earth with everyday goods, combs for hair, bowls for stew, because the next world recognizes the dignity of grooming and supper. Oaths were sworn on a ring that had heard many winter evenings, and therefore understood commitment. A raven on a post could be a messenger or a bird or both, and either way you repaired the net. The landscape itself became an ally trained by observation. Drifts collected on the lee side of fences, so you stored tools on the windward side because snow has predictable preferences. Streams froze last where they ran fastest, so you crossed them there when you must, which you did not, because patience is warmer than heroism. Ice sang before it cracked, a note somewhere between a harp and a warning. People listened and adjusted plans, thereby inventing the committee. Trails kept to ridgelines that wind scoured clean. This saved time and boot leather and gave you views you could point at later with a calm flourish. In summer, the midnight sun turned time into a suggestion, and haymaking into a long, kind negotiation between dew and dry. The smell of a good hayfield at 2 a.m. can make a person feel wealthy, which is exactly what a full loft is. Tools were unshowy extensions of hands. A bearded axe threw chips the way a poet throws clauses. A drac knife curled wood like a smile being invented. A loom clacked with metronomic politeness, turning sheep into weather forecasts you could wear. A net mended in the doorway let light pass through knowledge. Rope twisted from hemp kept its secrets better than parchment. Even the boat was a statement whispered in oak, lapstrake planking overlapping like roof tiles, ribs bent by steam, tar in the seams like a promise you can smell. People sat on the gunwale and did not fall in because habit kept them seated. Habit is a kind of furniture. When journeys stretched long, small graces mattered. A cup passed around the crew means everyone's lips share a circle, which is a practical lesson in equality. The helmsman's place collected a little more wind and a little more weather. Someone put a clipped piece of wool there anyway. A spare set of dry mittens waited in a closed bag, as sacred as any relic. A tiny wooden god rode in someone's pocket and kept quiet, which is the best behavior for gods under sail. Laughter sat just below conversation, and because laughter needs oxygen, Everyone learned to make room for pauses in their stories. Silence on a boat is not absence, it is inventory. If a storm pinned the ship to a cove for days, people turned delay into a craft festival. Someone carved a spoon from driftwood with exaggerated seriousness. Someone else repaired a seam with stitches so even that the boat blushed. Children collected shells and invented classification. A man tried to teach the seagulls ethics and failed, which delighted the children and had no lasting effect on the gulls. The tide repeated itself with such conviction that impatience seemed rude. Someone told the tale of the time the cod swam right into the net without being asked, which is approximately true, and everyone nodded in a manner that turned luck into method. In all of this, there's very little drama and a great deal of competence. The North demands continuity more than heroics. You put on layers because the air has opinions. You build with turf because the ground offers free bricks if you ask correctly. You steer by stars and the behavior of water because both are punctual. You dry fish on racks that look like skeletal houses and then live in a house that looks a little like a buried boat. When tools break, you repair them with parts none of which were originally intended for that purpose, and the tool thanks you by functioning. When a new baby arrives, you wrap the child in linen and then in wool and then in a story about someone who once crossed a fjord in fog and found the harbor by hearing the dogs on shore. The story warms more than one person. Now picture the evening page turning itself with a soft swish. The longhouse breeze. Someone banks the fire. The last spoon of skyr goes to the person still awake, which might be you at this very moment. A cloak becomes a roof for a sleeping shoulder. Outside, the wind changes key and then settles in. The boat at the shore nudges its mooring like a dog adjusting its bed. Stars appear with the unforced discipline of old friends arriving exactly when they usually do. And if your thoughts are still wandering, let them wander along the racks of drying fish, past the neat stacks of firewood, over the smooth handle of the axe, and into the small steady circle of lamplight on the table. The crystal lies on that table like a sliver of captured weather. Tomorrow it will point at the sun hiding in the cloud. Tonight it only rests. You may rest too with the ordinary courage that keeps people warm, which is the most reliable survival technique anyone ever learns. You might not expect a lump of sheep's wool to be a life strategy, but in the North it more or less was. Quietly organizing bodies against weather, the way a thoughtful librarian organizes shelves against dust. If you're still awake by the time we arrive at the barley that pretended to be bread for months, you can subscribe if you like, or just let your eyes do that heavy-lidded thing and miss entire sentences on purpose. Nothing here will chase you. We will move like frost on a window, small crystals forming a very patient landscape. The day often began by getting dressed for a climate that preferred arguments to hugs. Dressing was not fashion so much as architecture. Linen, worn next to the skin, wicked away a kind of honesty that cold air tries to remove from people. Over it came wool, and then more wool, each layer creating tiny rooms where warm air could take up residence and pay rent. Wadmal, the sturdy, homespun fabric that held its shape like a well-behaved opinion-wrapped legs and torso. The cloth was fulled by trampling or washing in lye until the fibers locked hands. Occasionally, lye had a faintly agricultural origin, so you wore a little of the farm whether you meant to or not. Nabending, that looping technique older than knitting and richer in patience per square inch, produced mittens that kept working even when damp. Leg wraps crisscrossed the shins, a sort of woolen lattice that turned snowflakes into polite visitors. Shoes combined leather with birch bark insoles, the bark a reminder that trees are good at being floors. On especially unfriendly mornings, fur made a final reasonable argument against numbness. The cowl that turned a head into a small, private room caught the breath, that would otherwise freeze on a beard and turn men into accidental chandeliers. A louse comb of antler lived in many belts because comfort also includes diplomacy. There were garters to hold things where they were supposed to be, and brooches that kept cloaks from becoming kites. You can measure a day by how often your clothing crackled when you stepped near the hearth dot. The house itself continued the project of discussing winter into cooperation. A longhouse was a ship anchored in the land, roof lines like keels turned upside down, turf draped over timber so that the building seemed to grow eyebrows of grass in spring. The sod was not a gasket. It was a living blanket, with roots interlacing the planks the way community interlaces errands. Inside, the central hearth made a reliable, glowing argument for evenings. Smoke rose toward a louver, considered the weather, and then negotiated slowly with the rafters, which darkened to the color of strong tea over the years. Soapstone lamps sipped up fish oil and turned wick into humility. Benches and chests along the walls doubled as beds and storage. You slept inside your furniture the way a letter sleeps inside an envelope. The animal buyer at one end radiated a chorus of faint heat, which is the kindest possible song a cow can sing. Floors like straw and rushes changed with the calendar, or at least with company. When storms buried the world, the door opened inward so that snowdrifts could not vote on the evening's plans. People sat close, not because of romance. There was no suspense here, but because warmth respects math. The house tolerated storytelling as a mild indoor sport. In the roof, smoke cured fish that dangled overhead like slow-moving punctuation, and rafters stored memories you could smell. On the water, a boat was the opposite of a rumor. It required truth in the hands. Navigation came in layered kinds. Like clothing, a person knew the feel of swells that had traveled a long way from the ocean's negotiating table, and the chopped-up texture of local wind. The color of water moved across a scale from slate to pale green, telling depth in sandbanks to anyone who had listened often enough. Birds performed obvious essays. Fulmars near cliffs, gannets with their day-bright dives over shoals, kittiwakes, telling you were near home with a voice that could cut bread. At noon, a simple sun shadow board, just a wooden disc with a peg told latitude by the length of the peg's shadow. It was the quietest "you are here" sign in history. In foul weather, a chunk of Iceland spar might come out of its pouch. Turn the crystal until the sky's glare stops arguing with itself, and the hidden sun declares its location like a shy guest raising a hand. At night, the North Star behaved like a nail holding the sky's plankwork together. You steered by, keeping that nail over a particular notch in the gunnel, and by remembering what yesterday felt like. Lead lines tasted the bottom with little tallow-smudged cups that came up wearing bits of the seafloor grit. Shell, fine mud like a pocketful of evidence. If you want the modern metaphor, think of a phone with no battery that still knows where you are because your fingers do. The sea had words for getting lost half villa, bewildered by the sea, and also procedures for getting found again. None of them loud. Food behaved like a second crew, the silent majority that kept hands strong. Fish dried on racks in wind so clean that it functioned as an ingredient. Stockfish became boards that could be cracked, soaked, and persuaded back into being food with patient stewing. Another method salted the fish before drying, making clipfisk with a firmness that stood up to travel. The name sounds like a polite little wave hitting rock. Barley became porridge that could be reshaped and fried into ash cakes next day, a leftover that turned thrift into breakfast. Flatbread, baked thin and crisp, stacked like coins whose only value was supper. Meat, salted for winter, slept in. Barrels with iron hoops that understood responsibility. Skyer-cultured milk thick as quiet insistence traveled in skin bags, its tang arguing pleasantly with bread. Sour whey, a byproduct with ideas, pickled things because acidity is a kind of patience. Honey turned into mead when yeast was allowed to be curious. Water traveled best as small ale because nothing ruins a voyage like a barrel trying to become a pond. Dried berries, crowberries, bilberries stained hands and thought kindly of scurvy. Even the cooking fat knew its job, render tallow with. A little ashlie, and you get soap for hands that believe in boats. None of this was dramatic. It was a pantry that slowly breathed. Everything killed respectfully became equipment. Hide turned into boots, belts, harness, and vessels waterproofed with birch tar. If you care to see discipline, watch a skin seam tightened with a bone needle. Sinew unzipped into thread both strong and slightly elastic, ideal for joining things. That would rather not part shoes, boat seams, patience. Bones declared themselves tools, awls, needles, toggles, and handles that fit the hand like inherited advice. Antlers softened hot water, then bent into combs with teeth fine enough to disagree with lace. Horn, warmed and pressed, flared into translucent panes for shutters windows that remembered being animals and let in the kind of light that flatters a stew. Hooves boiled down into glue that turned the workshop into a confederacy. Tallow plus ashlie, as we mentioned, produced soap. The first time someone rubbed this on wool and realized it lifted grease, they must have nodded very slowly. Whale, bone found or traded, could underpin a roof. In Greenland, it sometimes literally did, ribs agreeing to be architecture. Walrus ivory became game pieces and grips, the sorts of small, dignified objects that pass between hands and outlast stories. The principle was not waste nothing exactly, but recognize potential before it introduces itself. Plants participated with understated enthusiasm. Angelica, the tall, segmented herb that looks like geometry practicing for a parade, lent leaves and stems to broths and teas. It was greenhouse courage in a cup. Yarrow found bleeding unimpressive and suggested a halt. Planting those ribbed leaves trodden underfoot near paths came to the rescue of scrapes and insect quarrels. Juniper smoked meats and also agreed. To be a flavor, the berries tasted like winter, deciding to be interesting. Birch bark yielded tar to careful fires. The tar sealed bowls and soothed small holes in skin, a versatile temperament and sticky form. Pine resin chewed as gum cleaned teeth and amused archaeologists centuries later, who found tooth prints in old lumps and could, if they wished, meet the chewer through time. Iceland moss lichen really thickened soups on days when meals wanted help being meals. Nettles surrendered their sting to boiling water and repaid the indignity with iron, which is a decent exchange. Bog myrtle joined brewing as part of Groot, the herbal mix that kept drinks sociable before hop monopolies. It also made midges reconsider their life choices. If a remedy had a side effect, it was usually tastes like a field, which people accepted because health sometimes does. Hardship training was not a seminar, it was the weather. Children learned balance on bone skates that made frozen ponds into quiet classrooms. They learned to swim because boats are honest. They learned to row by rowing not miles at first, but minutes that became hours while elders adjusted the rhythm like patient metronomes. Wrestling styles such as Glyma taught the useful habit of staying upright despite someone else's plans. The ballgame Notliker played with sticks and not quite enough rules, honed speed and the awareness of elbows, both valuable on board. Harbor stones used for strength tests waited on certain beaches, each with a name and a reputation. A boy who could lift the half-strong stone earned a kind of credential. The full-strong stone wrote him a letter of recommendation. Cold baths were not a moral lesson. They were rivers in spring. Darkness in winter taught a schedule that turned candles into philosophy, use them or don't, but either way except the evening. Even boredom trained patience. Anyone who has mended a net for the second hour knows how to arrange thoughts into a quiet queue. Resilience also lived in the mind's furniture. Fate word was not an excuse, but a weather report. One dressed for it. Oath sworn on a ring. At the thing, the local assembly made promises heavy enough to keep people near the truth. A small pendant in the shape of Thor's hammer sat warm against the chest, not because it deflected lightning, but because symbols like courage borrow a shape. Sagas and verses circulated like communal memory sticks. The poet at the bench did, not raise hearts to battles so much as lower shoulders from the ears. When labor turned repetitive, kennings, the metaphor puzzles of skaldic verse entertained brain corners, calling the sea a whale road or sword wound ice, letting language practice its stretches while hands practiced theirs. Death, when it came, was not invited to dinner, but it was placed at a far chair with decent tableware. Valhalla existed as a rumor with excellent catering, and if that rumor made a sailor untie a frozen knot without complaint, then myth had done a day's work. Even fear had employment. It kept boats away from certain reefs that had names, but no survivors. There was also the long, cooperative hum of a community that understood weather better than it understood individual glory. The thing meant to measure disputes into solvable sizes. Tattoos were rare, but calluses were widespread and told similar stories. Feasts repurposed scarcity into choreography. One household contributed a pig, another barley, another the miracle of a kettle that refused to fail. Rope was made together, tar was stirred together, roofs were thatched while someone told, for the 7th time, about the winter when sheep learned to open gates. When a ship came home, everyone present was slightly wealthier in news. When a ship did not, neighbors measured silence, set shoulders to repairs, and invented a decent way to keep going. None of this looks dramatic on a tapestry. It looks like people filling the day so that the day will fill them back. You can look closely at any tool and see the conversation between materials and hands. The bearded axe kept its weight low, making it eager in the swing and gentle in the wrist. The loom's heddles memorized patterns and forgot them without sulking, which is a good policy for memory. The steering oar, pinned at the starboard side, read the sea and sent messages into a palm that learned to answer with the smallest tilt. A net mended indoor light let the day pass through while the future caught on the knots. A soapstone pot accepted direct flame without cracking because it did not take things personally. Even the clothespin, simple, broad, easy to work with mittened fingers, showed design that had shaken hands with weather. If you want a single principle to put above these objects, it is this: simplicity keeps a better diary. Night in the longhouse did not so much fall as fold. Someone banked the fire with the muscle memory of 1,000 evenings. Someone else set the next day's barley to soak, because tomorrow appreciates early investments even when it is made of sleep. A child put a comb on the beam where combs go. Boots reclined near the door, edges whitened with salt like quiet maps of old puddles. Outside, the wind tugged at the turf and then became bored. A boat bumped a landing stone like a dog sighing in its sleep. The sky's black plankwork revealed a familiar nail, and if you stepped out to the privy and squinted east, you could almost tell what weather was telling you about itself. Back inside, the lamplight fattened into a small island. Talk thinned to soughing sounds and the microscopically comic snore of someone who will deny snoring. The crystal some sailor's sunstone lay on a shelf as if resting were its main job. Tomorrow, perhaps, it would help a hand find the sun inside a cloud. Tonight it was only a smooth, cool promise, which is often enough. If your eyes are heavy by now, you can let them close exactly as a door closes in a snowstorm, deliberately, with a quiet latch, and with every intention of opening again when the house is warm and the porridge has decided to be ready. You might not expect a single hair from a sheep to act like a tiny air conditioner, a thermal accountant, and a life coach all at once, but in the north, a fiber of wool did exactly that. patiently trapping warm air the way a careful bookkeeper stacks notes in a ledger. If you're still awake by the time we get to the barrels of grain that sailed farther than some people, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know, and the wool won't mind. We're going to drift through what Vikings actually did to keep living, which turns out to be a long list of quiet tricks that never auditioned for hero status. Because hero status doesn't boil water or keep your toes. We'll move slowly, like frost learning the edges of a window. Getting dressed in the frozen north was less personal style and more architecture. First came linen, pleasant against skin and not at all sentimental about moisture. Linen pulls dampness away and files it under taken care of, which is perhaps why it's still smug in summer. Over that wool, not one layer, but several, because warm air likes to live in small apartments. The fabric of choice was wadmal, thick and cooperative. Fold until its fibers linked elbows and refused to break ranks in a snow squall. Mittens and socks weren't knitted, not at first. They were made by unwinding, a looping method that looks like knitting's thoughtful ancestor and keeps working even when damp, which is the kind of relationship you want with your clothing. Leg wraps spiraled around shin swollen bandages, against weather held by ties that specialized in not giving up. Shoes carried birch bark insoles because trees, among their many talents, make excellent floors for feet. When the air bit like an opinion, fur answered like a very calm counter-argument. A hood or cowl made its own climate around the face. Breath warmed the fabric warmed the breath, and everyone called it even. There were accessories. In this winter conversation, brooch fastened cloaks with the reliability of a good hinge. A louse, comb often carved from antler kept the peace, because comfort is partly about refusing to host a small civil war. Needles and shears lived in little pouches. Thread might be spun from wool, or from sinew if a seam needed stubborn strength. Ironing existed, more or less, a smooth stone or a glass smoother pressed garments, on a board in a process that sounds like a meditation and looked like a chore. Clothing had a sound crisp near the hearth, soft outside in falling snow, and people probably knew one another by that sound long before they said hello. If the day promised wind, an extra layer was a wiser decision than an ambitious plan. The house completed the outfit. A longhouse crouched low under turf so thick it grew hair in the summer, which is to say grass. Timber ribs arched under that sod, an upside-down boat built to ride out storms that preferred verticality. A doorway opened inward so that snow couldn't make executive decisions overnight. Inside, the long central fire behaved like a patient relative, always there, a little smoky, generous with heat. Smoke rose to a smoke hole and then changed its mind, drifting sideways to cure fish and darken rafters the color of old tea. Soapstone lamps sipped fish oil and gave a practiced yellow light that made everything look quietly accomplished. Benches along the walls were daytime seats and nighttime beds, with chests beneath storing clothing, tools, and the memory of last year's barley. You didn't so much live in rooms as share a long, warm hallway with everyone else, including the goats at the byre end who contributed, without being asked, a low-grade radiance. Floors were straw and rushes the way a sensible person wears slippers. You renewed them the way you renewed decisions as needed. Storm days rearranged the world into one long interior. Someone fed the fire with split driftwood that had already endured an entire conversation with the sea. Someone stirred a pot that had been stirring lives for decades. The air was complicated. Peat, smoke, dried fish, wool fat, birch tar, and the faint, honest smell of wet leather considering its options. By the door, tools hung from beams in silhouettes that were almost friends. An axe, a rake, a ladle, and the house listened to the weather drum on the turf and chose not to reply. Communal warmth did the rest. When bodies sit shoulder to shoulder, the math gets better. Heat stays where it's appreciated. At night, shutters of wood or horn closed over windows, turning drafts into distant rumors. A dog found the warmest square of floor because dogs have degrees in thermodynamics. No one hurried. The storm could finish before the story did. Everything changed at the waterline, where boats translated patience into motion. Navigation without maps wasn't magic. It was listening with more body parts than usual. The ocean gives away secrets in a code of textures, long swells from distant winds that roll beneath your hull like helpful sighs, quick chop that tattles. On local gusts, a smoothness where a current shears the surface into polite glass. Birds annotate the margins. Gannets draw straight lines over schools. Fulmars sign their names near cliffs. Puffins leave trajectories that reek of home. A man or woman with a lead line, just a weighted cord with length marks tasted depth in arm lengths, and if they smeared tallow in the little hollow at the lead's base, brought up samples of the bottom for inspection, grit, shell, mud, proof. On a string dot at noon, a sun shadow board a disc with a short peg let you read latitude by the length of a shadow. A quiet instrument that said, "You are here," in the voice of someone who has never raised their voice. On cloudy days, a piece of Iceland's spar might come out. When you turn that clear crystal and the sky's glare resolves into two images, you align them until the polarized light agrees with itself and the hidden sun stops hiding. You don't shout. You point the boat and keep rowing. At night, the North Star sits like a nail holding the sky's timber together. Put it over a known notch on the gunwale and you're repeating a sentence sailors have spoken for 1,000 years without words. Smell and sound help too. You can hear surf before you see land. You can smell kelp if you're paying attention. And paying attention was practically a religion. Voyages required food that knew how to wait. Fish dried on racks in wind so clean it counts as an ingredient. Stockfish became so hard it rang when tapped, then soft back to food in a stew that taught patience to appetite. Salted versions Clickfist kept even longer, a polite agreement between salt and time. Barrels held barley and oats. You could grind them into meal, boil them into porridge, or press them into flatbreads that stacked like edible shingles. Mead rode along in skins and casks, company for evenings and a sort of optimism in a liquid state. Small ale-week beer made. Water trustworthy because the brewing process inconvenienced the sorts of things that make water memorable for the wrong reasons. Butter traveled in wooden tubs, wrapped like a treasure that turns everything into food. Skyr, the thick, cultured dairy that is forever halfway between a cheese and a compliment, stored easily, and the leftover whey soured obligingly into a pickling agent that guessed what the future needed. Sea salt saved everything else. Even the barrels learned. A good cooper kept staves tight so that the ocean stayed outside, which everyone agreed was the better arrangement. Daily life turned into a sort of quiet engineering. You used every part of an animal, not because a list said so, but because unclaimed usefulness is basically bad manners. Hide became boots, belts, bags, and tent covers, with edges sealed by birch tar that also scented the workshop like an honest. Forests, bones shaped themselves into needles, toggles, gaming pieces, and handles. Antler turned to combs whose fine teeth persuaded lice to reconsider their housing policy. Horn warmed, pressed, and scraped fin-made translucent panes for windows, letting in the kind of light that flatters stew and people equally. Sinew peeled into threads with just enough give to stay tight when wet. That's the kind of character you want in a scene. Hooves boiled to glue so adhesive that carpenters nodded to themselves. Tallow met ashlie to make soap, which looks humble, until you remember what work hands do in winter. A little suds grants dignity to cold water. Whalebone, when trade or luck allowed, shouldered roofs like a retired giant volunteering for architecture. Nothing dramatic, but everything honest. Plants and simple remedies carried a domestic kind of sorcery. Angelica grew in tall, segmented umbrellas and entered the pot like a cheerful cousin, adding vitamins before anyone knew the word. Yarrow had a talent for bleeding that even warriors respected. Crushed and bound into a wound, it whispered, "That's enough now." Plantain those ribbed leaves near paths, pulled the sting out of stings and the heat out of scrapes with a competence that's hard to advertise. Juniper berries smoked meat and flavored spirits. They tasted like winter attempting charm. Birch bark yielded tar under careful fire. The tar sealed bowls and made small holes in skin less ambitious. Pine resin chewed as gum cleaned teeth and entertained archaeologists centuries later when they found ancient lumps with human tooth marks still pressed in, which is possibly the most relaxed time capsule ever created. Iceland moss, a lichen with patience, thickened soups when a stew looked thin. Nettles gave iron and fiber after boiling had diffused their opinions. Willow bark brought its subtle analgesic gift to headaches and hurts. No one called it chemistry, but the body understood gratitude all the same. Remedies ended with, and then rest, which people did because there was always tomorrow to be good at. Hardship. Training began at an age when boots were still negotiating with feet. Children learned to balance by walking on wet logs and by wearing bone skates on winter ponds, which is a polite way of teaching both courage and the concept of friction. Swimming lessons happened because boats happen, and everyone agreed water is friendlier when you know what to do in it. Wrestling Glyma taught a person to stay upright despite a determined friend's efforts, a skill with applications well. Beyond sport, Nutliker, a ball game with sticks and a brisk sense of humor, trained legs to turn corners with decisions attached. On certain beaches, heavy testing stones waited, each with a name and a reputation. You lifted one, and suddenly you knew something about yourself that no conversation could have given you. Weakling, half strong, full strong, or the rare, beyond strong. Categories more poetic than insulting, and a handy resume when boats needed crews. Daily drills were quiet. Nets wanted mending, which is how fingers learned small, exact patience. Oars wanted sanding. Tar wanted stirring. Rope wanted splicing. All of it wanted doing before weather decided to pose questions. Cold baths were not a moral crusade, just rivers and the body adjusted, which is their specialty. Darkness trained people to schedule light the way today we schedule battery life. Use a little here, a little there, pockets of brightness to get us sensibly through to dawn. Even boredom trained endurance. If you can watch porridge thicken without tampering, you can probably ride out a headwind. Resilience didn't only live in muscles. It nested in ideas. Fate or word was spoken of the way we speak of weather. Firm, unoffended by opinion, something you plan for and rarely argue with. Oaths, sworn on a ring at the local thing assembly, quilted communities together with language sturdy enough to hold. A small pendant in the shape of Thor's hammer lay warm against many chests, not because it performed miracles on command, but because courage appreciates a shape to hold on to in the dark. Poem's skaldic verse ran on formulas and clever metaphors. Called kennings, the sea as whale road, the ship as sea steed, a shield as war moon. These were more than ornaments. They were mental handholds when the day's work slipped and needed rescuing. Sagas were memory palaces spoken aloud. You learned your grandparents' weather reports, plus a good recipe for getting through February. The afterlife had practical uses. Valhalla, the roaring hall of the honored dead, sat at the edge of the map like a promise written in large, dramatic letters. Even people who suspected they would not be invited found the rumor useful. It reminded them that a brave death is less embarrassing than a foolish one, and that courage could be a quiet thing, like keeping your place on an ore bench when your shoulders are busy with their complaints. Belief acted as a winter coat for the mind, not necessary in July, very nice in January. Runes carved on handles and amulets offered blessings so modest they often came true protection. Luck, good harvest, because people treated those words as instructions rather than guarantees. The mind cooperated with the body, and the body returned the favor. Community stitched it all together. The thing heard disputes and made them smaller. Feasts turned scarcity into choreography. This household provided a pig, that one a sack of barley, someone else a kettle that could outlast a story. When a ship came home, the harbor filled with news, which is a currency better than silver for certain problems. When a ship didn't, neighbors moved silently through the list of tasks. That must be done when sorrow doesn't pay bills. No one pretended winter was a villain or summer a lover. Seasons were colleagues with strong opinions, and you learned to work with them because employment was permanent. Hospitality was law, not because people were nice, but because in a landscape where distances are taller than they are wide, refusing a meal is a kind of vandalism. A person might carry a little extra bread in their pouch simply because a stranger could turn into a friend by the second slice. Tools reveal character, and these tools preferred competence over spectacle. The bearded axe kept weight low for better. Swing control, which is also decent life advice. The steering oar, set on the starboard side, wrote letters to the water and read the replies in the palm of the hand holding it. Loom weights clicked softly in the wind like a metronome for chores. A soapstone pot accepted direct flame without shattering because it had already practiced not panicking for a very long time as a rock. A cloak pin large enough for mittened fingers told you that design had actually met winter before it offered suggestions. Even a simple rope, tarred and coiled, was a lesson in cooperation. Twined strands stronger together than apart, politely resisting the temptation to untwist. Evenings arrived without drama, which is their specialty. Someone banked the fire with. Practiced economy, coaxing embers into an agreement that would last until morning. Someone else set barley to soak, because tomorrow appreciates early attention. Boots rested near the door with outlines of dried salt like maps of old errands. A child placed a comb on the beam where combs live. Outside, the wind tested the turf with small, skeptical tugs, and then moved on to other projects. If you stepped out, the sky would show you the North Star exactly where it had promised to be, and if clouds had barred it for the moment, the sound of water against stones would serve as a kind of time. Inside, the lamp flame reduced everyone's worries to silhouettes. People spoke softly because loud speech wastes heat. If you're still awake, you might picture a crystal one of those pieces of Iceland spar resting on a shelf. Tomorrow, it may help a sailor find a hidden sun in a sky full of opinions. Tonight, it is simply cool and smooth, a promise with edges. In the corner, a net waits for hands in the morning, and a stack of flatbread waits for common sense. Wool hangs near, the rafters catching traces of smoke that will somehow make it warmer later. The longhouse breeze. The world has not finished being cold, but it has agreed to let people keep living in it, using small, repeatable tricks that never shout, never hurry, and never quite run out. If your eyes want to close now, you can let them the way a door closes on a winter night, on purpose, with a soft latch, already thinking kindly about the warmth you'll find when you open it again. You might not expect a cloak pin to be a life-saving device, but in the north, a simple brooch could mean the difference between a breeze and an argument with the wind that you were never going to win. If you're still awake by the time I reach the part about barrels that knew more about patience than kings, you can subscribe. Or not, I'll never know, and the brooch won't either. Tonight, we are walking very slowly through the survival techniques of people who treated cold like a neighbor, occasionally convenient, occasionally helpful, and always there. Nothing dramatic will happen. The most exciting event will be a Mitten turning inside out and still doing its job. Getting dressed began before Dawn tried the door latch. Linen went first because linen is polite to skin and impolite to sweat. It wicks dampness away so quietly you'll only notice later when you are not freezing. Over that came wool, the national habitat of warm air. Norse wool was often fold beaten and washed until the fibers interlocked like old friends, and woven into wadmal, a cloth so sturdy that some places used it in place of currency. Layering wasn't fashion, it was architecture. A thin tunic, under a thicker one under a cloak, created apartments for heat, each level furnished with little pockets of air that refused to go outside. Now-bound mittens, stitched with a looping technique older than knitting, kept their structure even when wet and came off the hand like small boats, thumb sails set to content. Leg wraps spiraled from ankle to knee, the wool slightly rough, so it gripped itself. Feet met birch bark insoles that worked like tiny wooden floors, insulating the step from the indifference of frozen ground. If the day planned to bite, fur answered. A hoot edged with fox or dog warmed breath and cheeks at the same time. It even smelled faintly of weather, which is either pleasant or merely true. Clothing had accessories that were not vanity so much as cooperation. Oval brooches fastened apron dresses with the dignity of cupboard hinges. A bone or antler comb slid through hair and drove out the politics of lice. Shears, needles, and a thimble lived in a pouch that always knew where to be. Sinew thread repaired a seam that was tired of pretending. On special days, dye added cheerfulness. Madder gave red, woad gave an honest blue, and lichens gave a purple that looked like twilight had been persuaded to stay. The loom in the Wong house could sing all winter, warp threads hung with clay, or stone loom weights that knocked softly like a slow metronome. If a garment needed smoothing, a glass or stone smoother rubbed the cloth on a board. It wasn't quite ironing, more like convincing. Every item had the slightly smoky fragrance of living near a hearth. The way books kept in a library smelled faintly of time. The house finished the outfit. A longhouse sat low, turf-thick, and patient, its roof grown over with grass that remembered summer even when winter forgot. Inside, a central fire worked with the methodical calm of an old accountant. The smoke rose, then reconsidered, curing fish where it wandered and giving rafters the color of tea. Soapstone lamps drank fish oil from tiny basins and exhaled a warm yellow that made wool look clever. Benches along the walls were daytime seats and nighttime beds, with chests underneath that breathed secrets of stored grain and old tools. Windows closed with horn panes or wooden shutters, which turned drafts into suggestions. Floored with straw that could be renewed whenever life asked for a fresh start, the room held children, elders, guests, a dog with a PhD in warm spots, and goats whose contribution to heating was not poetic but effective. Storms would beat drums on the turf. Inside, someone stirred a pot that had been seasoning itself for decades. The house didn't brag. It merely refused to let weather make all the decisions. When the sea was the plan, clothing added thoughtfulness. A hood that could be fastened under the chin stopped wind from collecting your ears. A sailcloth cape turned spray into polite conversation. Boat crews wore layers they could peel and replace like remarks in a long discussion. The ship itself preferred practicality. Planks overlapped in clinker style and were riveted with iron that tolerated salt better than many people do. Tar warmed in a pot and brushed into seams until the wood side. The steering oar sat on the starboard side, the steering board side, and wrote long letters to the water. A bale, carved from wood, made a neat bowl for throwing the sea back into itself. Anchor stones lay ready for beaches where iron didn't. Volunteer doubt navigation without maps was less mysterious and more attentive than legends admit. Sailors listened with their hands. Long swells from a far wind moved under the hull like slow ideas. Chop toddled on mischief nearby. A lead line just a cord with a notched weight gave depth and arm lengths. Smear tallow into the hollow at the lead's base, and you can learn the bottom by touch. Sand sticks differently than shell. Mud smears like a rumor. At noon on a clear day, a simple sun shadow board told latitude, just a disc, a peg, and the patience to look. When clouds made decisions, a piece of Iceland spar might come out of a pouch. Rotate that clear crystal and the sky obligingly splits into two images. Align them until the polarization says there, and the hidden sun becomes a location, rather than an opinion. At night, the North Star pinned the sky like a button on the cloak of everything. Keep it at the right height above the horizon and your course behaved. Birds told stories. Gannets mean fish. Kittiwakes mean cliffs, ravens. Released from a ship mean land if they don't feel like returning. Smell has distance. Kelp announces itself. Snow on a mountain has a particular reflected brightness that a person who's been at sea too long will never again mistake for a cloud. None of this asks for genius. It merely asks you to notice the same things every day, which is a quieter kind of intelligence. Food for voyages was less cuisine and more agreements with time. Fish dried on racks until it could politely break your knife. Stockfish soft in a pot like a grudge being let go. Salted fish clip fisk tasted of endurance and of the day many months ago when you decided to keep having dinners in winter. Oats and barley traveled in barrels that sighed from the weight of their good intentions. You could grind them into meal, stiffen them into flatbreads, or make a porridge that took whatever was available and promoted it to supper. Small ale carried less drama than water and more confidence, because brewing confiscates certain problems. Mead rode in wooden casks as a reward that tasted like bees remembering flowers. Skyer thick, cultured, and undecided between cheese and yogurt kept, well in cool hold spaces. The whey left over was a pickling brine that made vegetables reconsider. Mortality. Butter went in wooden tubs, wrapped against temptation. If you want a very gentle punchline, in many cases the barrel traveled farther than the fish it carried ever swam. Back home, survival turned into a daily habit of using things, until they revealed all their talents. An animal offered food, of course, but also materials. Hide became boots that shrugged at mud, belts that held up plans, bags that minded secrets, and tent covers that persuaded rain to look elsewhere. Sinew peeled into threads with a stretch that held tight when wet, making it a kind of cooperative muscle for clothing. Bone carved into needles stubborn enough for leather, toggles with opinions about closures, fish hooks whose efficiency embarrassed fish. Antler turned to combs so fine they asked lice to move along, and to knife handles that stayed warm in winter. Hands, horn pressed warm and scraped thin, let in a candle's light while keeping out most of the air. Horn windows gave a room the unloud glow of perpetual late afternoon. Hooves simmered into glue. Tallow and ash lye married into soap in a ceremony no one called romantic, but everyone respected. Birch bark boiled to tar-sealed seams and made shoe soles brave. Whalebone, when luck or trade offered it, then into sled runners or propta. Roof like a volunteer giant. There is a certain contentment in a workshop where nothing is wasted because imagination is cheaper than imports. Herbal mowage acted like a quiet second opinion. Angelica tall, hollow-stemmed, was both vegetable and vitamin advice. Yarrow bled on behalf of wounds, which is the kind of friendship you remember. Plantain leaves, those ribbed green bookmarks of paths, cooled stings and scrapes and looked pleased with themselves afterward. Juniper berries prodded the flavor of stews and kept meat properly suspicious of microbes. Pine resin chewed as gum. Clean teeth and entertained archaeologists who later found the lumps with tooth marks pressed in, as if someone had signed the past with molars. Birch leaves steeped into a tea that tasted a bit like spring having second thoughts. Iceland moss thickened soups into something spoon-worthy. Nettles boiled first to settle their temper-donated iron and fiber. Willow bark offered a gentle compromise to headaches. Honey sealed wounds with sweetness that complicated infection. None of this claimed miracle status. It all promised better, which is often enough, especially if rest follows and a friend brings a bowl of something warm. Children learn to be durable the way they learn their names, repeatedly and with affection. Bone skates laced onto winter feet and taught balance by degrees. The ice kept a ledger of the results and was fair about it. Early skis, long planks, with upturned noses, made travel a sort of quiet sliding. You pushed with a single pole and arrived not so much at a place as at a mood. Wrestling Glima trained legs to be loyal and hips to be sensible. A ball game with sticks, not liker, taught decisions at speed and forgiveness afterward. Beaches kept testing stones with reputations. Names varied, but the categories were clear. Useless, half carrier, half strong, full strong. Lift one to your knee, and you joined a club with no meetings and one rule. Boats appreciate strong backs. Rivers offered cold baths, not because anyone was virtuous, but because rivers were available. The habit did what habits do and made the next time easier. Endurance quietly accumulated, like kindling under a bench-top. Society itself was a survival technique disguised as civility. The local assembly thing met at a chosen field or rock each year, and law spoke in the open air. Disputes were reduced to sizes people could carry. Oaths were sworn on a ring that remembered hands. Hospitality wasn't merely nice. It was. Legislation. A traveler received bread and a bench, and, if lucky, a story. Turning someone away in a harsh landscape is the kind of decision that comes back with interest. Feasts choreographed scarcity. One household had a pig, another had barley, someone had a kettle large enough to audition as a bath. Together they produced a meal with leftovers that tasted of friendship salted lightly with smoke. Trade knitted edges together. A boat returned from a fjord over with narwhal tusk, or a stay at a foreign market brought home a handful of silver coins that chimed pleasantly in a chest. Neighbors shared labor the way we share sarcasm, easily, frequently, with good results. Belief kept company with weather. Fate woven by Norns was discussed like a road already laid. It wasn't that choices didn't matter. It was that choices felt most comfortable when they walked paths that had a shape. Pendants of Thor's hammer hung at throats, small anchors for courage. Runes carved blessings into handles and charms, not because wood needs letters, but because people do. A carved sentence that asks for protection often persuades its owner to act protectively, and that's nearly the same thing. Skalds spoke poems with kenning so neat they felt like mental furniture. A ship was a sea steed, a sword a wound ice, the body a bone house. Language made the world manageable, like drawing little labels on drawers. Valhalla promised a heroic afterlife full of fighting and feasting, which may sound loud, but the promise worked like a blanket folded neatly at the foot of a bed. Most people never needed the blanket. Knowing it was there made sleeping easier. Tools, too, taught composure. The bearded axe cut and carved, the thin beard shape allowing a careful handhold near the wood for fine work. The adze-shaped planks, with a hollow thog-thog that sounded like time practicing. A whalebone scraper pulled fat from hides and made a rasping music. A soapstone pot sat directly in flame and considered cracking beneath its dignity. The loom weighted with stones clicked in winged dreams. Even a simple rope, tarred and coiled, said something about society. Fibers twist together in opposite directions so the whole will hold. A person who has spent a day plaiting cord understands coalitions in their fingers. Night came gradual. Like a rule everyone liked. Someone banked the fire to a low constellation of embers, each coal. A tiny red opinion on the subject of tomorrow. Someone set a wooden bowl of barley to soak because breakfast always arrives sooner when you prepare it the night before. Boots dried near the door with white salt maps on their leather, proof that the day once had edges. A child prayed in too. Lines of verse that asked for what children usually ask for: continued parents, no accidents, maybe a good story. Outside, the wind tapped the turf and then stopped, as if embarrassed to make a scene. The sea kept up its conversation with the shore. The sky, if it was feeling generous, laid out the aurora like quiet green cloth. Windows glowed horn yellow. The dog sighed. People slid into blankets that had memorized their shapes. If you're still listening, picture a small sack that smells faintly of tar and fish oil. Inside it is a crystal that knows where the sun is hiding, a length of line that knows how deep the water is without looking, and a comb that knows the correct number of teeth to make a child hold still. A sail rolled and tied, dreams of wind. A barrel prays too seldom, plans how to keep butter until a spring no one has met yet. Wool hangs from rafters, willing to learn the weather of your shoulders. The longhouse breathes, and if it seems like the whole culture is just a careful stack of small, cooperative acts, that's because it is. The survival trick is not bravery shouted across a battlefield, though that has its place. It is choosing the right thread, the right layer, the right moment to stir the pot, the right star to hold in the corner of your eye while you row. Those choices train sleep as surely as they trained life. You can rest now. The brooch has the cloak. The embers have the night. The sea knows the way home, and if it doesn't, the birds do. You might not expect a wall of snow to count as architecture, but in the north, a carefully shaped drift is basically a polite conversation with the wind that ends in your favor. The Vikings understood this in the way you understand which corner of your kitchen is friendliest to bread dough. They were experts at tiny decisions repeated patiently, a tighter stitch here, an extra fistful of straw there, a lid fitted so exactly that the barrel sighed when it was seated. If you're still awake when I reach the part about letting butter, nap in wooden tubs like a contented seal, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know, and neither will the tub. We are here for the slow details of surviving in places that greet you in winter with a gentle statement. So, you've decided to be outside? Clothing did more diplomacy than speeches. First, a layer of linen, because linen keeps secrets from sweat and allows skin to exit situations gracefully. Over that, wool spun fat for warmth, or spun tight for weather structured into wadmal. The kind of cloth that can pay taxes because it behaves like money. Then more wool, sometimes a hooded cloak, sometimes a jacket so fulled it had the personality of a firm handshake. The stitchwork mattered. Nalbinding, that looping older cousin of knitting, produced mittens that treated damp like an uninvited guest. Socks came in opposites, shaggy for warmth, smooth for boots. Leg wraps spiraled methodically up the calf, each turn like a well-placed thought. If the day needed claws, fur obliged. Fox fur rims of foods where breath tipped to frost, silver. Boots that planned to get acquainted with slush. And sheep everywhere, because sheep are the original heating appliance disguised as a pleasant animal. Pins and brooch were not jewelry so much as negotiation tools. An oval brooch could hold a dress, a shawl, and a conversation in place that the longhouse understood weather like a librarian understands silence. Walls stacked of turf cubes, grass. On top, like polite hair insulated in a way that made wind reconsider its life choices. A smoke hole in the roof behaved like a scheduling assistant for clouds. The hearth, long and central, worked in shifts: morning porridge, afternoon dye vats, evening stew, and overnight, embers that drew maps of tomorrow. Soapstone lamps, carved with confidence, sipped fish oil and committed to a quiet yellow that flattened anxiety. Beds lined the walls with chests underneath that held textiles, tools, and the memory of last year's visit from a cousin who fixed the door latch while telling a story about a stubborn goat that may still be going. In winter, animals moved into the far end of the house. Cow breath rose like a mild weather system. The dog copied the shape of the warmest spot. A hen provided 3 eggs in commentary. Someone beat skins in the entryway to loosen snow, someone else stacked peat blocks in an orderly pile because order is a kind of heat. Frost drew ferns on the horn windows at dawn and erased them by noon, a little art exhibition that never asked for applause. Outside, the world offered materials the way a sea offers waves, steadily and with preferences. Birch bark became a container that weighed almost nothing but remembered everything. Boiled to tar, it turned into the sort of glue that believes in commitments. Pine resin, warmed between fingers, made your knife handle less enthusiastic about slipping. A snow knife, edged from bone, cut blocks for walls that hummed almost silently in the wind. If you were sensible, you built your door on the leeward side in your path with a curve, because wind spends its energy on straight lines. A field of stones proved useful as anchors for a drying rack, which in summer displayed fish like sensible laundry. A weaving shed, half open to air, kept the loom humming when the house needed quiet. "We'll be out with the warp weights," someone would say, which is exactly what you say when your winter depends on getting textiles, right? And your summer depends on habit. The sea did not need you to be brave. It required you to be paying attention. Boats were clinker-built, their overlapping planks fastened with rivets and logic. A thin coat of tar brushed into every seam was the maritime equivalent of sending a polite note ahead. The steering oar rested at starboard the steering board side, because that is where steering boards do their best work. A baler lived on the floor and functioned also as a small soapbox for opinions about waves. Ropes were twist and counter-twist arranged in truce. A coil laid right stayed right. On clear days, you could use a only slightly paradoxical device, a disc with a peg that measured the shadow at noon, telling you quietly how far north you had wandered simply by disagreeing with the sun. On gray days, an Iceland spar crystal might appear from a pouch. Rotate it under the milk of the sky, and it separated light like a librarian separating whisperers, pointing where the invisible sun absolutely was. Birds had opinions that were nearly charts. Ox meant land, gannets meant fish, ravens released from the ship voted by returning or not. Whales and porpoises signed their names on the surface and compressed geography into a breath. Every evening, someone measured depth with a lead line. Tallow in the hollow of the lead came up with gift sand that said coast, shell that said bank, mud that said river mouth, and you began to know places by the texture. Your hand met in a smear. Provisions were time-made edible. Fish went to Rack's Hall, where wind and sun deducted moisture until the fillets clicked politely when tapped. This was stockfish, which could break your knife in the morning and your hunger in the evening. After a soak that tasted like patience, meat met salt like an old acquaintance. Barrels cradled it in brine and surprising serenity. Oats and barley traveled as grain, because grain is a negotiations expert. Ground into meal, it became porridge with memories of yesterday's hearth smoke. Baked on stones, it became flatbread that fit neatly into bags and schedules. Skyer lived on the ship as a quiet miracle of cultured milk that refused to spoil as quickly as logic suggested. Way left behind pickled vegetables without consulting vinegar. Butter slept in lidded tubs with water poured on top to discourage curiosity. And oxygen. Small ale rode in casks whose staves swelled into tightness the moment they tasted their job. Mead waited like a future good decision. If something fermented accidentally, it graduated to recipe. The cooper, the barrel maker, was a logistics officer and a kind of poet whose rhyme scheme was hoop, stave, Hoop, stave, seal, dot, daily life ran on the principle that everything handy is also honorable. A seal became food, then boots, then thread from sinew, then oil in the lamp, and finally a scrap of hide that softened a door hinge. Bone turned to needles that could bully leather, ice skates that glued laughter to a pond, and toggles that closed cloaks securely without making a fuss. Antler became knife handles that didn't surprise your fingers with cold, and combs with teeth fine enough to inconvenience lice into emigration. Bladders inflated into fishing floats, guts cleaned and stretched into strings for instruments, or cords for snares. Surviving required melody as well as meat. Horn wormed and flattened to sheets made windows that admitted a pleasant dusk all day. Wool that failed as yarn succeeded as felt, pressed and scalded into mats or insoles that persuaded feet they were welcome. Soap grew in pots where lye from leached ash married leftover fat in a ceremony conducted by a spoon. The result smelled faintly of the household and washed the household, which is tidy poetry. The herbal shelf lived more in memory than on a shelf. Angelica stalks were vegetables with a resume. They added greenery to stew and steadiness to sailors. Yarrow pressed. On cuts with a competence that felt personal. Juniper smoked meat and flavored nights. Willow bark conducted quiet conversations with headaches. Plantain leaves, those ribbed green bookmarks of paths, healed small dramas. Iceland moss thickened broth, asking only that you rinse its bitterness, a reasonable request for any guest. Bog myrtle perfumed ale like the day, deciding to be interesting. Pine resin chewed as gum cleaned teeth and left splinters of forest in your breath. Honey sealed wounds with the confident sweetness of bees who assume success. There were charms. To a rune carved on the haft of an axe, not because axes lack literacy, but because people like to see the requests spelled. A small pouch at the belt might hold dried berries, a crystal, and a sliver of soapstone polished by worry. Medicine, as ritual, ritual as reminder, both work better than most arguments. Childhood apprenticed to endurance as casually as to language. Winter produced bone skates laced to boots. Children learn the grammar of sliding from nouns like rink and verbs like fall. Skis answered for distance with polite speed. The single long pole in the hand taught rhythm. Wrestling Glyma made balance a reflex. A ball game with sticks, not liker, taught the social art of being knocked down and then discussing the matter over stew. Beaches held testing stones, each with a name that translated roughly to, this one is optimistic and this one is honest. Lifting them tested not only muscles but schedules, because if you could lift the full strong stone, you were less likely to miss a departure. Baths were their own houses, little steam rooms where stones drank water and gave it back as cloud. People scrubbed exactly the same worries everyone always has, and came out warmer and more convinced about tomorrow. Community functioned as winter's second fire. The local assembly, gathered at a field that remembered footprints. Laws were recited out loud because paper burns and memory likes an audience. Disputes traded volume for procedure. Oaths were sworn on a ring, and while the ring was iron, the ring's true metal was promise. Hospitality was regulated kindness. A traveler received a bench, broth, and the absence of questions until morning. Insults had rules, which tells you nearly everything about survival. Even emotions needed standard measurements. Trade stitched fjords to far harbors. A boat came back with soapstone bowls, amber that remembered sunlight inside itself, and a few silver coins that clinked like distant bells. Weddings redistributed tools and blankets, the exact same objects that kept people alive. Love wrapped in inventory tags is still love. Feasts were collaboration disguised as celebration. The biggest kettle always found the warmest fire, and On the table, you could read the geography of friendship: barley from one farm, dried lamb from another, a pail of skyr with a wooden spoon whose handle had been smoothed by every age in the room, belief insulated from the inside. Fate and the Norns appeared in conversation not as doom, but as scheduling threads measured, spun and cut, and still plenty of weaving left for hands. Thor's hammer pendants felt at the collarbones like little anchors, a reminder to be sturdy. Runes carved into the stilts of a bed or the beam above a door were requests dressed as art. The afterlife was discussed like weather. Perhaps tomorrow it will be clear enough for battles and dining. Perhaps tomorrow will be for quiet. The idea of Valhalla did not make people reckless. It lowered the noise in the mind so that tasks could be completed without the wind of worry. People sang. The songs were boats for memory. A ship was a seahorse in poetry and a wooden answer to distance and reality, and neither description contradicted the other. In long winter evenings, someone told a story that had survived several owners, and everyone added a small adjustment. That made the ending sit better on a shelf. Tools taught patience. The bearded axe allowed a hand to creep close to its work, shaving rather than chopping when finesse was required. A reminder that force is not always the senior partner. The adze spoke in percussion to the plank, hollowing a curve that remembered. The sea. A bow drill spun fire from friction the way a conversation spins sense from nonsense if you keep at it. A whalebone scraper made hides honest. A whetstone explained the benefits of persistence to knives and, by implication, to people. Ropes braided from basswood bark or hemp were a masterclass in cooperation fibers, twisted one way, then together. The other, disagreement resolving into strength. Even the humblest spoon, carved from birch, was a lecture on proportion you could attend 3 times a day without noticing. Night arrived like a slow favor. Someone shook straw into bedding until it behaved like a small field. Someone checked the door latch twice because twice is easier to sleep with. Someone slid the ash lid over the heart of the fire. Underneath, coals brightened briefly and then learned to wait. A pot was set near the hearth with water and a handful of grains. The culinary version of leaving tomorrow a note. Begin without. Me. Boots arranged themselves near the warmth like a well-mannered audience. Outside, the wind changed its mind, or didn't. A fox placed its black feet carefully across moon-bright snow. Stars appeared where they always appear, which is one of their nicer qualities. If your breath frosted the horn window, you traced it absent-mindedly with a finger and made a small fern. A little reminder that you live in collaboration with everything: the air, the wood, the stone, and the friendly habits that add up to survival. If you're still here, imagine a pouch at a belt, a whetstone with the edges rounded by years, a tinderbox that smells faintly of last spring, a splinter of sunstone that knows how to find what is currently hidden, and a length of line that can tell depth in a language only hands remember. Imagine a barrel that swells its staves to seal itself when it tastes ale, a cloakpin that keeps heat in while letting conversation out, a longhouse roof where summer grows quietly while winter rests beneath. The techniques are not tricks. They are courtesies extended to weather, water, food, and time. They work best when done regularly, preferably with a mug nearby. You can sleep now. The snow wall is still doing its job. The lamp has enough oil to think about. The tide is exactly where it should be, and in the morning, the boat will be there too, patiently explaining the horizon to whoever needs reminding.